But what everyone is missing about this period is that there was no world hegemon of Britain. There were 5 competing great powers or world states. And that's what I'm going to explain to you and describe each of those 5 world states in this video. The period 1880 to 1914 has become strangely relevant to today's world. A lot of people are looking at that period and thinking about how world order broke down then, how world order broke down over those 30 years in, rivalries between great powers that led into a disastrous First World War. How the world walked to that war. And my question in today's video, is that really the true story of the rivalry between great powers in the world between 1880 to 1914? And is that the most important lesson to draw from this period of history? The common story is that there was a British hegemon that was challenged by other European empires, specifically the jealous new German Empire. And it was this rivalry, this Thucydides trap, as Graham Allison described it as, that caused the disaster of the first great disaster of the 20th century. It was that western frontier of Greater Europe, the United States of America, that destabilized the unstable, highly fragile global colonialism of the late 19th century. And this video is the next in my series of videos on the true story of the rise and fall of global empires from 1400 to the current day. And I'm doing a bit of a deep dive into the period between 1880 and 1914. I've looked at the overview of that period. I've looked at visions of empire in that period. And today I'm looking at the section of John Darwin's book, After Tamerlane, that he describes as competitive coexistence, that describes the real nature of the world order before World War I. The competitive coexistence in a new world of global colonialism that existed between 1880 and 1910. There was a multipolar world between 1880 and 1914 as well as today. But it was a world that was multipolar in a world that had, as John Darwin wrote, and I described in one of the earlier videos, had for the very first time in world history experienced a global hierarchy of power and culture all around the world. This was new. The whole idea of world hegemony was really only possible after the establishment of this global hierarchy by the great powers of Greater Europe, by which John Darwin means Europe as such, but also North America and Russia. So it was a multipolar world in a world dominated by colonialism, by imperialism, and growing nationalism. But those isms often conceal more than they convey. So it's important to have a look at the underlying processes and tensions around it. And in a way, the whole idea of world order is a bit the same. A world order is a pattern people see in the chaos. It isn't really there. And behind the pattern that people see in the chaos is often tensions and conflicts and contradictory trends that are more important to really what would later happen. And in this case, I think John Darwin makes a very strong case that this order, world order of global colonialism, was a highly unstable order. It wasn't the era of the Pax Britannica. It was an era of the very fragile hold of these limited empires or world states on the world, and their riding of the dragon of the astonishing transformations occurring in the world. The industrialisation, the birth of new transport networks, of cinema and all sorts of other things we associate with our modern, more direct experience of history in the world. Of course, this era ended in World War I, and that story tends to dominate how the story is told. Indeed, in 2019, the financial journalist Martin Wolf drew on Graham Allison's book, The Thucydides Trap, to make the claim that the world order now looks like the one before World War I. He wrote that, as Paul Kennedy noted in his classic book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, the UK generated 23% of global manufacturing output in 1880. By 1913, this had fallen to 14%. Over the same period, Germany's share rose from 9% to 15%. This shift in the European balance led to catastrophic Thucydidean war between Britain and an anxious status quo power, especially once the Germans started building a modern fleet, and Germany a resentful, rising one. Meanwhile, US industrial output went from 15% to 32% of the world's, while China fell into irrelevance. Thereupon, US action determined the outcomes. Now, this is a familiar story to many people. The rivalry between Britain and Germany, is that what really caused the World War, and there's a lot left out of that story, which John Darwin will really educate you about. So let me just do a quick recap of the story to date. So in my first video on the 1880 to 1910 era, I sort of talked about the importance of this idea that in this period, for the very, very first time, a global hierarchy of power and culture was established around the world. It was driven by Greater Europe, by which John Darwin means Europe, Russia, North America. And it was advanced dramatically by the partition of Africa and the struggle to partition or to claim extraterritorial rights and economic power over Asia with their dying nations. The Ottomans, the Chinese, and Japan, and I guess Southeast Asia as well. And what's more, there were competing visions of the world and of world politics. There was a vision that, free trade would bring plenty for all, very similar to visions of globalization over the last 30 years. There were visions of the world filling up, of the loss of living room especially for the white races of the world, European and Americans. And there were also visions not only in Europe and America, but also in Asia and other states of an impending race war over this shrinking world. And I described all those in my Visions of Empire video. But the key thing to grasp about this period is that there was no hegemon. There were 4 or 5 states that shared global mastery. And that mastery was based on many things: economy, technology, transport, communications. This is the era of steam globalization. But it also found cultural expression in ideas of scientific racism and ideas in the civilizing mission, the white man's burden of Rudyard Kipling's famous poem. It was also because this whole rush to the head of this amazing sudden global mastery came to people. It also provoked a upsurge in ideas of world domination, which previously would simply been impossible, but now were supercharged by ideas that Europe and America had, and Russia had the resources, the dominance, the power, and the scientific civilizational advances to know the true laws of geography and history. And I've had the classic statement of this was Halford Mackinder's The Geographical Pivot of History, with its dreams of world domination through domination of the world island by some offshore balancing naval power. Now, the 5 states that exercised this global mastery were Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and the United States of America. And it's interesting, actually, on my Substack at the moment, I'm doing a world history tour of the great powers of today's world. And what do we find there? We have Russia, we have the United States, we have China, we have India. China's not there, India's not there, but India is kind of there because Britain in the 19th century would not have been the dominant power or the leading power that it perhaps was without India. And we also have Europe, in this case represented by 2 parts of Europe, Germany and France. And of course, there's a lot more to Europe these days. But Britain, Germany, Britain as in the British Empire, and all these states had empires of sorts. Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and the United States. These were the world states who could genuinely claim to exercise some sort of world influence and imperial domination in the world. Let's have a look at each of them in turn. And here I'm going to vary the order from John Darwin's book. Of course, you can read John Darwin's book yourself, and I highly recommend you do. And there's a link to it in the video description. So first of all, let's look at Britain, the one that, is traditionally seen as the hegemon of the world in many accounts. Like America received its hegemonic crown from Britain, who at some point got it from Spain or somebody else earlier on in history. But John Darwin really, as does indeed Adam Tooze, mock this idea of, America succeeding Britain as the world hegemon state. He notes there is some claim for Britain to be the leading world state of this time, but it doesn't really fully understand the particular nature of the empire that was the British Empire between 1880 and 1914. Of course, Britons like to think their nation led the world, but it is important to really invert this idea that it wasn't, Britain's virtues as such that was the basis of their empire. It was to some degree the possessions in control that Britain controlled that were the basis of its world power status, especially India, which John Darwin describes as the barracks and war chest of Britain. Poor India paid a service charge to Britain for the privilege of being its imperial possession. Something like maybe what J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump think Europe should pay to the United States today. And the settler colonies of the British Empire were more than just peripheral, unimportant backwaters like Australia and New Zealand. They were the most dynamic economies of the British Empire. sources of a lot of food and fibre and minerals and gold, critically, and also of manpower, reserve manpower for the wars of imperial rivalry. But overall, to 1880, the British Empire was mostly quite lightly peopled and barely developed. John Darwin describes it as an archipelago of colonies and spheres of influence. Often it was there, it exercised its default influence because others weren't there. But in this period between 1880 and 1910, as the world was filling up, the other powers started to butt up against the British Empire. And it provoked a response. What was previously fairly loosely held was forced into more formal claims of control and authority over these areas. And it also brought the British Empire rather a lot of trouble. It was scattered all over the world and it was running into trouble all over the world. One might draw a comparison there with the United States of today. And what's more, it was this drove a paradox in the British Empire. At one level, it was growing. In fact, the maximum extent of the British Empire was achieved shortly after World War I in the early 1920s, especially with its dominions in the Middle East or West Asia. But it went along with an increased anxiety of diplomats and strategists in the empire. They worried whether they could really control this scattered empire, which was having to put out firefights all over the world. And many of those firefights are known, Sudan and others. And I'll discuss the tragic partition of Africa in a later video. What's more, they were haunted by the risk that the jewel in the crown, the real jewel in the crown of the empire, India, ironically the jewel in the crown, given that the jewel in the British crown was stolen, the Kohinoor diamond was stolen from India, the jewel in the crown of India would rebel again like it did in 1857 in what the British called the Indian Mutiny and which Indian historians now call the First Indian War of Independence. And this anxiety was perfectly expressed in that famous essay by Alfred Mackinder, The Geographical Pivot of History, where he talked about the fear of Russian tyranny and of railways, a real anxiety that changing technologies would change the balance between sea and land powers. And what's more, some of the wars Britain was involved in the late 19th century didn't go very well for Britain. The Boer War, or the war in South Africa in the 1890s and early 1900s, where, of course, Britain invented the concentration camp, led to increased fears that other powers would exploit British weakness. And this provoked a frenzy of military planning and militarisation, as well as new diplomacy. The British, John Darwin points out, engage in some frenetic planning to work out what logistics they would have to solve if they were to control their Asian possessions, and they worked out at some point that they would have to purchase every single living camel in Asia in order to supply the vast British colonial possessions across Asia. Simply impossible thing to do. However, they did also establish a new naval fleet with fateful consequences, as was alluded to, I guess, in Martin Wolf's discussion of the start of World War I. And they formed a series of alliances with Japan in 1902, in with France, or an entente with France in France in 1904, and a entente with Russia in 1907. Increasingly, they focused on what they saw as the threat, which was Germany. Britain here was not playing the role of offshore balancer so beloved by, some international relations and geopolitical analysts. It was being a participant in the continental great power politics of the world. However, its rivals didn't really see it in the same way. They didn't really want to pick a fight with Britain scattered all over the world, especially since Britain was the hub, if you like, or the driver of its extraordinary commercial imperium that drove the modern world economy that grew with this period of steam globalisation. And I'll discuss that whole global economy more in a later video. Britain, that is, had really floated this world economic system, and it was in the growth of its navy, insecurely perhaps seeing fears that weren't there, but also seeking to contain potential rivals, including with a plan for a naval blockade of them. Britain's love of economic sanctions goes back a very, very long way. So that's Britain. What about its great rival Germany? It wasn't really a case, as we say, of Graham Allison's argument that it's rising, dominant hegemon Britain and challenger Germany. There were these other states. It was not a dyadic system. Germany, were they really a threat? Were they really the sort of revisionist power of international relations scholarship? Well, after 1904, Britain really did fixate on Germany as a threat. And I guess ever since, it's really projected some of that back into the discussion of World War I and the discussion of World War II. But in 1880, Germany was really a newcomer to great power diplomacy. It was only unified, or the various German principalities and states were only unified under Prussian leadership. Prussia had been a powerful state in Europe for a century or more, but all the other German states were really only unified by Bismarck in 1870. But this state consolidation really reflected some underlying cultural and economic strengths. The economy of Germany really took off in this period. Between 1873 and 1913, the economy grew by a multiple of 3, not 3%, but it was 3 times bigger in over that 40-year period. And this growth was driven by industrial goods, chemicals, and electrical goods. The German manufacturing, the basis of some of the major industries of Germany, some of the major industries of the world was really established in this period. What's more, German culture in many ways led the world in this period, a topic wonderfully discussed in this book by Peter Watson, The German Genius, Europe's Third Renaissance, the Second Scientific Revolution, and the 20th century. And you can see it just in the winners of the Nobel Prize and so many other things, so many of the key scientific and cultural achievements of Europe in the 20th century were from the Germanic world. Pan-Germanism was a thing. Some of the Norwegian winner of the Nobel Prize in 1903 was an advocate of a sense of common German culture, of a link between Norway and Denmark and Germany as part of the pan-Germanic world. In some ways, this culture claimed a cultural hegemony over Europe. And this was the world, if you like, of the Magic Mountain, Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, where Germany is, if you like, a kind of a cultural centre of the world, looking over to the east, looking down to the south of the east of the Slavic world, down to the south of the Greek and Italian world, but largely ignoring Britain and America. It had the largest population in Europe outside of Russia, European Russia, and it had a very efficient conscript army. Indeed, John Darwin says that by 1900, Germany had an excellent railway system and the largest population of any European state except Russia, good communications, a great industrial base, and a large population made Germany's conscript army the most efficient in Europe, and Germany itself Europe's greatest military power. Now, that power was used to collect what John Darwin describes as trophy colonies in Africa, but there wasn't really the same aggressive intent to develop a sort of empire of overseas possessions as in, for example, Britain had, as France did. The main game was really not Africa. For Germany, that is, it was both Europe, which I'll come back to in a sec, but also getting its share of the territories and economic assets, so to speak, of China, the Pacific, and the Ottoman Empire. New Guinea, Australia's former colony and northern neighbour, Papua New Guinea, was initially a German possession from the late 19th century. Some of the great anthropologists of the world came to Papua New Guinea via Germany, and it was only after World War I that Papua New Guinea became an Australian colony rather than a German colony. It was one of the things Australia insisted upon at the Peace of Versailles. As John Darwin wrote, if China was partitioned, as seemed not unlikely, the Pacific boxed up into maritime spheres, and the Ottoman Empire dismantled, another likely prospect by the mid-1890s, then Germany should claim a share that reflected its status and economic potential. If the future was to be a silent Darwinian struggle for survival or supremacy in a closed world system, any other course would be a virtual abdication, and there one can see the dangers of seeing the world in brutalist realistic terms or as in closed world orders rather than a far more open and dynamic world system. So really, Germany pursued a half-hearted pursuit of extra European territory. It really wasn't pursuing a place in the sun, and it wasn't really jealous of Britain despite British subsequent accounts. It backed off in many of the great power squabbles of the late 19th and early 20th century in Morocco, in Samoa now an American territory, West Africa, the Baghdad Railway to the Persian Gulf. And its main economic interests were really in Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And this reflected a long tradition of German commercial, financial and economic preeminence in Central and Eastern Europe. German traders, German banks, German industry, German crafts. There were calls from German propagandists for a United States of Europe, the first EU, if you like, in this period. Explaining these ideas, John Darwin says, the achievement of a German hegemony in Europe at the expense of Russia, France and Britain would more than compensate for the lack of an empire on the British model. It would also smash the geopolitical props on which global colonialism had been built thus far, and open the way for a new global partition in Germany's favour. But to gain such a hegemony by force was much too dangerous a plan to be adopted lightly or even debated openly by those who made policy. One of the reasons why the debate among historians over German war guilt has been so inconclusive. Up to 1914, it remained an imaginary prize that unforeseen circumstances might suddenly offer. Really, why would Germany need to sort of, knock down all these fences, which it had a cultural presence, an economic presence, a cultural de facto hegemony over in any case? It didn't need to conquer Europe the way Britain conquered India. It was the dominant cultural influence in Europe already. But nonetheless, Britain sought to contain it with its ocean fleet, and I guess the rest is history. Let's look now at France. Now, France was the weakest of these world states, and that's why John Darwin says there were 4 or 5. He almost equivocates a little over whether to include France. But often French history is viewed, especially from Britain and the United States, in a rather distorted lens. And I think the story of the French Empire is incredibly important for the world today. France is one of the UN Security Council members. France still has colonies in the South Pacific, and France has only recently been, I guess, pushed out of major parts of Africa where some of this sort of, the colonial empires were established here in this period of 1880 to 1914. It's also illustrative of the fact that power comes more from money and guns. It can also come from diplomacy and cultural influence. So France in this period had a strong military, was a strong land military power. Of course, Germany and France, or Prussia and France, fought a war in 1870, which was a catastrophic loss for France. But it was still a major military power. But its naval power was declining and being, neglected financially. It was second, however, to Britain in foreign investment in the world. It was a huge economic power, and its investment was especially important in that resource-rich, rapidly growing part of the world, Russia. Only 1/6 of the world's territory. It also enjoyed enormous cultural prestige and influence. Think of, all the stories of Paris in the 19th century, of Paris as, the centre of world culture, of La Belle Époque, the great period of art and culture and wealth and aristocratic lifestyles of the late 19th century. But it also had a large, rapidly growing Afro-Asian empire. In 1880, and between 1880 and 1910, this empire grew spectacularly over those 30 years. And in a way, it drove some of the health and the wealth of La Belle Époque. The French overseas possessions grew by a multiple of 12, that's 12 times, from 350,000 square miles to 4,600,000 square miles over those 30 years. That's an astonishing growth in the territory under the control of France. The populations controlled by that French Empire grew similarly, in fact more so, by a factor of 16, from about 3 to about 50 million people. And its empire stretched from Madagascar to Indochina to South the South Pacific, New Caledonia, which is still a French colony, folks, and to northwest and equatorial Africa. And of course, we've seen some of those states push out French neo-colonial influence in recent years. But this French empire had three broad weaknesses in John Darwin's account. Its domestic population was stagnant and its industrial production was lagging. We won't go into all the reasons for that, but that was one of the problems for France. The economic potential of its overseas possessions was also relatively weak. It was an astonishing, fast growth of this empire, but it had no India, it had no settler colonies like, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. And this rapidly growing, perhaps too rapidly growing empire had to be defended by naval power. They were all a long, long way from France, that France simply couldn't afford to put the money in to sort of keep its fleet updated. So John Darwin claims it was much more vulnerable to a knockout blow than the other great powers who were positioned in Europe. And these factors were, I guess, well known to French political leaders, French diplomatic leaders. It informed the diplomacy and the thinking about the world that led into the confused diplomacy, the confused great power ideas, the fluctuating ideas for who France should ally with in the 30 years before 1914. Should France form an alliance with Britain? Should France have a reconciliation with Germany? Opinion was divided, and that division perhaps also contributed to some of the tragic mistakes of the sleepwalk to war in World War I. Paradoxically, of course, this weak European empire of the 19th century has been one of the empires that has held on to these colonial possessions longest and in the most, committed form. New Caledonia, still a French colony. Mali, Niger, Gabon, of course, only have recently had dramatic changes in their sort of relationship with France. And of course, the Vietnam War of the 1950s, 60s, 70s began as a war over whether or not France would hold on to that colony in the 1950s. Let's now look at Russia. Of course, Russia had a bad war in 1914. And that bad war fed directly into the revolution of 1917. And of course, the revolution led to Russia being excluded from the Versailles Peace Conference and interwar diplomacy, leading to all sorts of subsequent things. So as a result of all those events, people often forget that Russia was central to World War I, a point brilliantly made in this book by Dominique Levin, Towards the Flame, Empire War and the End of Tsarist Russia, which I think if one really wants to understand the long, long background of Russia-European relations, I think it's a very important book to read. People often forget Russia was central to World War I. People often forget Russia was central to the dynamic of conflicts between great powers in the 30 years before World War I. They tend not to think of Russia as a world state in this period, despite it reaching from Poland to Vladivostok and down into Central Asia as well. And there is also, of course, a tendency, given the Russian Revolution, to play old tropes of Russia as an utterly archaic, autocratic, sort of pre-modern sort of society. And, the peasant commune was a major part of Russian society, but there was a different side to the story. John Darwin says that this excessive focus on the archaic old regime of pre-revolutionary Russia is a myopic, as in blind, approach to history. And that idea has very much been fed by this, I guess, Anglo-American tradition, starting with Halford Mackinder's geographical pivot of history, which really recreates images of Russia as the Asiatic horde. And I think I discussed that a little bit more in my video on Russophobia, and I might include a link to that in the video description below. But in fact, he points out one of the striking things about the history of the first half of the 20th century was the extraordinary resilience of Russia and the Russian world, given the astonishing catastrophes that befell it in that time. By 1949, the Soviet Union is the world's second superpower. But in the 50 years up until that time, it had endured the 1905 revolution, the 1917 revolutions, I guess the sort of Stalinist revolution itself, the catastrophe of World War One, the demographic catastrophe of World War One, and the Russian Civil War. Terrible famines, not only in Ukraine, but also in Kazakhstan and other parts of Russia. Of course, the astonishing tragedy of the War of Annihilation that was fought by Germany against the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945, in which 1 in 7 Soviet citizens died. The tendency is to just sort of wipe all that off and forget, well, there must have been a few things going for this Russian Empire before 1914. What was the source of some of this resilience? There certainly were weaknesses of the old Russian Empire, and John Darwin notes that a little bit like the fragile British Empire stretched across everywhere, Russia's empire across, northern Eurasia down into Central Asia was little more than a shell before 1880. It was only beginning to do the various Muslim Central Asian conquests like the Caucasus and whatnot. There are some great classic Lev Tolstoy stories, of course, about all of that. The Northeast Asian presence of the Soviet Union was only being established with the Aegon and Peking treaties of 1858 to 1860. And Russia was a power in the whole sort of greater European diplomacy in China's century of humiliation as well. In the 1860s, Russia implemented major reforms, including the emancipation of the serfs, something the sort of, the peasant bonded labour, kind of like slaves, that was fundamental to the Russian economy for a couple of centuries, and which occurred, I might add, a couple of years before the United States of America ended slavery. But these changes to the economy, the peasant character of most Russian society and the serf economy was only just starting to be modernised. There were setbacks in 1877 and 1878 during the Ottoman, Russo-Romanian, Turkish War. And John Darwin says, or quotes someone from the time describing the Russian Empire as alternate bravado and vacillation. But Russia also had, or the Russian Empire had also had strengths as a world state in this period, and it was part of the broader, enormous transformation of Greater Europe's global hierarchy. Russia, too, was part of this kind of wave of Western civilization, if you like, or belief in the in Western civilization. And there was a very practical story as well. There was an astonishing growth in industrialization between 1860 and 1900. The output of coal in Russia grew by a multiple of 50 over those 40 years. The output of steel grew by a multiple of 2,000 over those years. You know, the industrial proletariat formed famously just in time for the Russian Revolution. And Ukraine, which we talk about a lot today, it was really developed in this period as the wheat, the wheat fields of Russia, of the Russian Empire. Odessa became the great port city for this grain trade. But again, it's interesting to note just how late that development really is. And Odessa, now in Ukraine, at this point in its history, in the late 19th century, it's, the people of Odessa spoke 49 languages, I think, and only 10% of its population spoke Ukrainian. After 1894, there was enormous French investment in Russia, which led, was second major source of capital and around the world. And of course, there was the Trans-Siberian Railway and also the Orenburg-Tashkent Railway, which was one of the things that Halford Mackinder was so worried about in the geographical pivot of history. But it also supported a new dynamic economy across this enormous territory, which was enabled in a way to form as a single territory, perhaps for the first time, given the scale of distance to be covered. There was also a massive migration and settlement into Siberia, with over 5 million people moving there and thousands into the Muslim Khanates of Central Asia. And the key elements of its geopolitical position were spread around the world. In Europe, Poland was what John Darwin described as the defensive bastion of the Russian heartland and a lever of influence in great power diplomacy. Zbigniew Brzezinski never forgave Russia for that. Ukraine was the dynamo of the new wheat export economy. Its wealth and its railways strengthened its hold over the Caucasus, the Volga Valley, and its oil fields in Baku. The oil fields themselves reflected the new world economy that was forming, the new critical resources that were changing the geopolitics of the world, and that I'll talk about more in my video on the global economy. In Central Asia, settlers were moving in, a cotton industry was developing, and there was a strong Russian monopoly over its trade. And even though Russia, took a few blows in the Russo-Japanese War between 1904 and 1905, provoking in part the 1905 Russian Revolution, Russia was still a major Pacific power, despite a few cases of overreach in Korea and Manchuria. John Darwin summarises by saying, "For all the brittleness of its imperial system, its technical backwardness, economic fragility, and weak cultural magnetism," I don't know if I totally agree with that. This is the era of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky, etc., etc. It was Russia's silver age, its golden age of literature. Russia had not kept pace with the rival world states. It had followed its own distinctive trajectory into global colonialism. And that's a really important point. global colonialism was not a single mould. It's the problem with words like any ism, colonialism, imperialism. It often conceals more than it reveals. And there were many types of world states. There were many types of empire. There were many trajectories into global colonialism, and that was Russia's. Let's look finally at the fifth and perhaps most disruptive of these world states, the one that often gets left out of the story of the rivalry of great powers between 1880 and 1914. It often gets left out of the story of why World War I happened. That is the United States of America. And again, it's important to re-emphasize that in John Darwin's account of the global rise and fall, or the rise and fall of global empires, he talks about this idea through the 19th century of greater Europe, a greater Europe, culturally, ideologically unified to some degree under a form of liberalism and comprising Europe proper, North America on the western frontier, and Russia, if you like, on the eastern frontier. In a way, believing they were part of a unified Western civilization or civilized world was newly flush with confidence and dominance because it seemed to dominate the rest of the world and was, I guess, hoping to carve up the rest of the world in its interests. So the United States was not separate from all of that. It was actually closely connected to all of that. And some of my earlier videos on the 1750 to 1830 and 1830 to 1880 period, you might want to check out to get more of the background to that story. But again, in this era, there was a symbiotic relationship between North America, the United States of America, and Europe. Indeed, by 1900, the largest population of European origin in the world, except for in Russia, was not in Europe. It was in the United States. Just think about that. Of the three parts of Greater Europe, the biggest population of European origin was in Russia, the second biggest was in North America, and the smallest was in Europe proper. The United States was becoming, if you like, a normal great power, no longer a revolutionary, radical sort of breakaway state, despite its legends about itself. Yet it did retain distinct marks that are often forgotten in the story of American independence and separateness from the stains of European old world ancient prejudices. It was openly avowed racial segregation. This was the era of the end of the Civil War and the Jim Crow period, and it also had a distinct ideological tradition of democratic populism. But it was increasingly behaving and acting like a great power. This is a fascinating period, especially given in recent times with Donald Trump's inauguration address and many others. The model, the inspiration, the example of the 1890s with McKinley and Theodore, Teddy Roosevelt is being invoked. And indeed, in this period, Roosevelt adopts the sort of naval power strategy advocated by, I think it's Alfred Mahan, and pressures Spain, as in the United States, pressures Spain to take over the colonies of Philippines, of Cuba, and others. It expressed what was called the Roosevelt corollary to assert its power over the Caribbean, and it claimed extraterritorial territorial privileges in East Asia, just as Britain did, for example, in Hong Kong and Macau, and Portugal did in Macau, and so on. America was pivoting to Asia long before Barack Obama, and it was becoming more of a colonizing empire, but within limits. Frederick J. Turner, the historian who wrote about the significance of the frontier in American history, and you can, I'm doing a reading of that in my Substack. If you become a paid subscriber at my Substack at jeffrich.substack, you can listen to my discussion and reading of that famous essay, which again is remarkably timely given the evocation of the frontier spirit by Donald Trump and in his inauguration address, and J.D. Vance's acting out of a hillbilly harangue against Europe in his Munich Security Dialogue address. But F.J. Turner wrote that America, this was in 1910, he wrote that America was an imperial republic with dependencies and protectorates, a new world power. And this was also occurring in the context of the closure of the frontier, the key event of the 1890s that F.J. Turner based his theory of American history on. Where would America expand to with its frontier pioneering spirit after the closure of the frontier, the filling up of the world? Where would it go? Well, it went to the Philippines, it went into Latin America, and ultimately it went global. But there are qualifications to this account of the US empire. Of course, often those nuances get glossed over in discussions of US empire. It was different, which doesn't mean it wasn't an empire. It just means that not all empires are the same, that you really you need to look at what the unique characteristics, the crooked timber of the US empire really was. And the key differences were that the United States had a sort of semi-detached global colonialism. It was not involved directly in the African partition. It had no Asian colonies before the 1890s. And it had a largely self-contained economy, a very important issue to think about when people talk about tariffs and the model of the American industrial system from the 19th century. Only 5% of American economic output was exported abroad in the late 19th century. As John Darwin writes, the economic colonies of American business lay in the west and south of the United States, not overseas. There was no consensus for adopting the aggressive style or military preparedness of the other world states. They simply didn't have to. They certainly fought wars over those territories. They fought wars with, Mexico and other Latin American states. They fought wars with Spain for control of the Philippines, the Caribbean, and other territories. But the key fact about this era was the self-contained and astonishing industrial growth of the United States in this period. John Darwin writes, what turned out to be critical in shaping American views was the astonishing growth of the US industrial economy, setting off fears of exclusion from world markets. And indeed, the historian Adam Tooze calculated the GDP in purchasing parity terms of the major empires of the world in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century in his book The Deluge, and the absolute astonishing growth of the United States is evident. It really overtakes the global hegemon at this period of time in terms of economic resources. So, but the key point that people really need to understand here was that as the world was filling up, as the frontier in America was closing, as the pioneer spirit of America was looking for, new territories, not yet Mars, but certainly other parts of the world, other markets of the world, America was going through a sea change. And it saw these other great powers, Britain, which of course it had fought an independence war from a century or more ago, France, Russia, Germany, which it had close people-to-people ties with. It saw all of these countries, trying to claim other parts of the world, claiming other markets of the world, and all growing for different reasons incredibly quickly in this Gilded Age. We've heard about the astonishing growth of Germany, the astonishing growth of the French overseas possessions, Britain's commercial imperium. And they were worried that partition of the world into blocks would be against their interests because only 5% of their global output was going overseas. They had to project themselves out into the world. They were worried about exclusion from markets around the world. And from the late 1890s through 1900, what we see is the development of the American open door policies, which lead to an insistence that other parts of the world open their markets to the United States. A partition was contrary to the interests of the United States. John Darwin writes, with so small a share of imperial real estate, little prospect of increasing it, and by 1913, much the largest manufacturing capacity in the world, it was hardly surprising that American leaders should come to regard any global partition as more and more harmful to American interests. And perhaps it's a fateful lesson, given Trump is invoking the memory of McKinley's tariffs of the 1890s to make America great again. To note that, in a way, the late 1890s, the assassination of McKinley in 1899, I think, or maybe 1901, was the high watermark of American tariffs, that they started to decline after then. As America started to try to reposition itself, to open up the doors of the rest of the world to have a different attitude towards a more global economic system. So there we have the five major empires of the world on the cusp of World War I. It was not a stable world order. It was not a monochrome world of colonialism or European colonialism, European imperialism. It was certainly a world of colonies and empires, but it was not a stable world order. All these five world states there was no hegemon. There was rules and cultures and processes and real conditions constraining them. It was not anarchy. It was not a free-for-all. And they were all riding a dragon that fueled many grandiose and paranoid visions and hegemonic dreams. They were pretty much all experiencing astonishing surges of economic activity, of cultural activity, of technological capacity, of fundamental transformations of their world and of their societies as well. ending slavery, changing peasant societies into industrial societies. But it was not a dynamic of hegemon and challenger. It was a dynamic of competitive coexistence, as John Darwin says. And in the 14 years of before World War I in particular, there was a increasing anxiety and an increasing risk that a great fissure would open up in this world. It was not the splendid world of plenty of the free trade globalization ideas. It was a world of competitive coexistence and much more real historical processes. But there were enormous tensions in this gilded age of a shrinking world. All those tensions were seething, and we'll explore them more in the discussion in my upcoming videos of the economy and culture. And although there were tensions, the story is not as it is usually told. I've explained to you how it was not the story of hegemon and challenge. It was not the Thucydides trap story. It was not the Germany-Britain story. John Darwin writes, "There is an old tradition in historical writing in which rampant imperialism, red in tooth and claw, formed the anarchic prelude to the great conflagration of the First World War. But before 1914, there was little sign that the world's most powerful states intended to fight each other for global supremacy. Instead, they adopted a form of competitive coexistence and recognised that for the time being at least, a rough balance of power existed between them." They shared a broadly similar view as to how to relate to non-European, non-greater European peoples. They took it for granted their culture, their civilization was superior, and that the world ought to be divided up between great empires. And they were worried about their instability caused by the dying empires, the dying nations of the Ottoman Empire, China, and Iran. And to some degree, it was over their fate that there was a great risk that this world order, this illusory world order, this fragile global colonialism would break down. There was always a risk that the diplomatic rattling of sabres would get out of hand. A panicky ruler, an opportunist advisor, a rush of blood in the press, or simple miscalculation might tip the balance between peace and war. The fragile stability of global colonialism and the peace of the world really depended upon the mutual restraint of the main European states and their respect for their own continent's uneasy balance of power. If that were to change, then the geopolitics of empire would be plunged into chaos, as of course it did in 1914. You can click into my entire playlist on the rise and fall of empires, where I'm going through John Darwin's masterful After Tamerlane, the absolute must-read book if you really want to understand the history of empires and geopolitics today. And subscribe to my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com for my world history tour of world powers, where I will help you rethink and reimagine the role of all these 5 world powers today: India, China, Russia, the United States and Europe, with a bit of quality world history. And why not check out this video right here that starts my series on the rise and fall of global empires, John Darwin's wonderful book, After Tamerlane.